Welcome back to the report. Now, it's not been long since a set of anti-terror laws going through the Parliament were accused of encroaching on individual liberty. But now new legislation is set to go even further down that road. Yasmin Khatun has been taking a look.
A week on from an election which saw David Cameron not only retain his seat as Prime Minister, but expand his reign with a full team of Tory parliamentarians. Proposals the government were unable to push through whilst in coalition with the Liberal Democrats have now resurfaced. Earlier today, Prime Minister David Cameron told the National Security Council that a counter-extremism bill will be in the Queen's speech later this month. The bill includes powers to close down premises and extremism disruption orders, with a separate bill to be introduced later in Parliament, which would include the retention of records of phone calls, emails and other data. With further powers to be handed down to the Charity Commission, we asked advocacy group Cage how they felt about the bill after recently being targeted by the organisation.
Well, this is quite ironic. A few months ago, in the last set of counter-terrorism legislation, in the form of the Counter-Terrorism Security Act, the Charity Commission had been promised an increase in resources and funding to tackle radicalisation and extremism in terms of the form of charities. And what we've already been mainly aware for a long time is that they already have these resources. A recent report came out some time ago and said half of the charities under investigation are of Muslim or Islamic heritage. So that shows that they are clearly investigating, maybe over-investigating. And I think we've already seen from a number of voluntary bodies who work with charities, like the NCVO, who come out recently with their own independent report to say that they need to be seen to be politically independent. At the end of the day, the Charity Commission, of course, is accountable accountable as a public body, but at the same time, they need to conduct these investigations in a fair and balanced way. They've gone after a number of organisations like our funders that may have funded Cage in the past, and have actually got undertaking that in the future that these organisations, along with another 12, will no longer fund Cage. So again, they are trying to use every single arm of the state in order to stop you from campaigning, from organising, from advocating an opinion, and it's really dangerous. What we need to draw a line is where does criminality start and end? We've been very clear and consistent, and I think with a lot of organisations as well. You draw that line in terms of actual criminality. If someone is actually inciting harm or calling for harm, that is criminal, that needs to be tackled, prosecuted, dealt with. But what has happened is that we are now going to a big grey area where the government, for the first time on record, I mean, a basic student of constitutional law can tell you, you cannot go after people unless they've committed a crime. And David Cameron is now saying today that he will pursue people who have not committed crimes. What country are we living in?
The proposals arose after the response to the killing of drummer Lee Rigby in London 2 years ago, with a tough stance on what David Cameron has called a poisonous ideology. The counter-extremism bill carries serious implications for communities across the UK, but in particular for its 2.7 million Muslims, as ideology becomes the focus to countering terror. Yasmin Khatun, The Report.
Well, joining me to discuss that story are Mohammed Amin, who's chairman of the Conservative Muslim Forum. By Skype, we're joined by journalist Dilwar Hussain, and on the phone by Talha Ahmad from the Muslim Council of Britain. Welcome to the programme, all of you. Mohammed, David Cameron said that previously the government would leave you alone if you hadn't broken the law. It's a huge step to say that's no longer the case in Britain, isn't it?
Well, first of all, let's look at what the problem is. There's a set of behaviours which are clearly criminal, trying to commit acts of terrorism, encouraging acts of terrorism, incitement to murder, etc. Those are criminal activities. The real problem is that before somebody becomes somebody who's trying to commit acts of terrorism, they are radicalised. Somebody is involved in helping them to change their entire worldview so that it becomes completely hostile to British society, where you get two people who've grown up in Britain wanting to go out and kill a British soldier. And do you simply wait, allow our young people to be perverted, to be indoctrinated, or do you try to do something about it?
But something else is intended here, because preparation of a crime, that's already a crime. Incitement to crime, that's already a crime. So the government intends something more than that here.
Yes, precisely. The issue here is basically propagandizing people in a way that they develop a set of values which is completely hostile to the values that underlie British society. So you're producing people who are either incipient terrorists in this country, or, as we've seen with the tragic case of these young girls from the East End,
would you have to say? I mean, the discussion has been that you could be against democracy. Well, there's lots of people who think that the situation in this country is insufficiently democratic and would like it transformed, perhaps completely. Are they to be arrested?
The detailed definitions of exactly what counts as acceptable behaviour and what counts as unacceptable behaviour in this new counter-extremism bill will need very careful drafting. And at the moment, the bill is not yet available. It's extremely important that we get this right, because we have to carry the population as a whole with us. There's no point in producing a set of definitions, and as soon as you actually prosecute somebody under this new law, everybody says that's outrageous, that's a terrible restriction of free speech, what that person was saying was perfectly reasonable. If that happens, we failed.
Okay. Dilwar Hussain, do you think that I know you're unlikely to agree with this policy in the first place, but if you did, can you see any way that it could be workable?
Well, of course not. Any kind of bill or policies that essentially aims to be thought police, which cannot be empirically, academically substantiated, is going to fail. And what we're actually having here is the same problem that we had with the CTS Act and previously under Labour certain anti-terror laws, and that is the ill definition of terms such as extremism and British values. So what we're actually seeing now with today's announcements of new counter-extremism measures is that the government's not actually going to pursue criminal activity. It's not even going to pursue intentional incitement. What it's actually going to do is going to pursue the Muslim community for holding certain thoughts, beliefs, and concepts. Now, I don't believe the government is committed in clearly defining what they deem to be extremism, because what you'll actually find is if they seriously started doing that, then what they're going to do is actually criminalizing aspects of normative Islam. Now, Mr. Amin, I have to disagree with you unequivocally. We cannot say that to prevent acts of criminality or violent extremism in its prior, second, third stage, it just can't be substantiated. There is no proof whatsoever to say that non-violent extremism, again, a term which, the whole conveyor belt theory, unsubstantiated, ill-defined, used in an ad hoc fashion for the government to basically set an example and make an example of certain Muslims within the community. It just cannot be implemented like this, and it's deemed to fail. And what you're actually going to find is that bills and measures such as those mentioned by Mr. Cameron today, it's going to isolate the entire Muslim community, and it's only going to exacerbate the situation. That's what's going to happen.
Okay, Talha Ahmad, let me bring you in. The MCB's issued a statement about this. It says that it's liable to infringe civil liberties, but it also says that it's open to dialogue with the government, that it's willing to sit down with the government and talk about these things. But it's pretty clear the government really isn't interested in that kind of discussion. Well,
let me clarify. I don't think MCB has asked necessarily for a dialogue with government. What we have said is that when this proposition comes literally weeks after a major counter-terrorism bill been made into law, we think that what we need to do, instead of bringing new legislation, there needs to be a national conversation around this issue of radicalization and what exactly we do. And it is in that spirit Muslim Council of Britain stands committed to any kind of dialogue, whether it's with government or with others, because we do recognize that there is a problem and that the security of our country is very, very important. But it has to be addressed in a proportionate and fair manner.
And do you think that there's any way in which that's going to happen with this piece of legislation? I mean, can you, for instance, imagine circumstances in which it would be a good idea to close down a mosque?
Well, no, I think that first of all, the propositions we hear, most of them are still propositions, have not been tabled formally. We don't exactly know what powers government is seeking to bring in. But it seems to me that all the vibes around this legislation are the wrong kind of soundings that we should hear. No one should be criminalized for holding a view If a view we find disturbing, what we should do is rightly to challenge that view. If need be, there may be a reason to, for example, put somebody under, some kind of, I don't know, surveillance if necessary. But to criminalize thinking, I think it's just wrong and unbefitting of British values.
Well, that's an interesting question, because all this is premised on the idea that we have something which we all recognise as British values. And when the government is asked about what those actually are, well, firstly, they have a bit of difficulty coming up with a list, but to the extent that they have come up with a list, it's not credible. They say, oh, well, democracy is a British value. Well, that'd be a shock to Americans and French people for a start of. Tolerance. This is the only tolerant society in the world. I mean, these are attempts to make us think that we're a uniquely democratic or a uniquely tolerant society, when that simply isn't true.
Well, first of all, the one mistake which I've commented on in the past in this is to talk about them as British values as if we were implying that they were exclusive to Britain, because they're not. These are the values that underlie British society. They are also the values that underlie American society. These are the values that underlie our society. We have a clear, defined list of values. I support those values. And if people don't support those values, the first thing I want to do is to try to keep them out of my country, if possible.
So,
really?
so if someone was to contest what you regard as those values, it wouldn't be part of a British value to allow that debate to take place.
Well, first of all, what I said was that if I want to keep them out of my country if they're not already here. So if somebody wants to become a British citizen, they will need to sign up to these values. If they're not prepared to sign up to these values, I'm quite confident that when we see the legislation, it is likely to contain provisions saying that to become a British citizen, you need to sign up to these values.
Dilwar, what do you imagine your reaction might be if you were to be asked to sign up to a set of values that Mohammed and David Cameron were to put to you?
Well, first of all, if we're talking about British values in terms of democracy, rule of law, tolerance and transparency, then I'll first question the government if they're committed to these values. If you claim to be a champion of democracy, then why is it that you're hell-bent in supporting and selling weapons to the most undemocratic regimes in the Muslim world? Where is your championing of democracy there? If you claim to be a champion of free speech, then why is it that you're now trying to censor intellectual debate? Is the government that insecure about its secular liberal values that it cannot defeat the Islamist ideology? Thirdly, you talk about tolerance or religious tolerance, yet you see the government seems to have a serious problem with tolerating a certain brand of Islam which it cannot define. And if you're talking about transparency, then we know very well that even within the heart of the British establishment, there's a clear lack of transparency, whether it's the sex scandals, whether it's expenses claims. There's all kinds of shenanigans happening within the British government. So first, before I sign up, I'd like to see the British government themselves sign up to this imaginary set of British values and see if they'll stick to it and if they'll be committed to it. Because to be absolutely honest, I'm sick and tired of listening to our politicians talking about British values, democracy, rule of law, transparency, etc. and so forth. Yet they're the first people that will transgress those values and witch hunt an entire Muslim community and breaking those values themselves. So no, I won't be signing up to those values until I start seeing that the government themselves are committed to those values.
Talha, what do you think would be the reaction if the so-called mosque closure orders are part of this legislation, as they're trailed to be? What do you think would be the reaction the first time a mosque is closed down by the government?
Well, I think it would be very, very counterproductive to what government is seeking to achieve. You know, what this whole debate shows is that, first of all, there is no consensus on British values, for example. Right? There is also no consensus on the definition of extremism. So the first thing government ought to have done is to embark on a nationwide conversation to see whether we can reach some kind of consensus. So if we now proceed with some of these measures, which would be classed as draconian powers under any civilized free society, and those are exercised at a time when there is no consensus about the British values, about concept of, extremism, I think, it's going to be catastrophic, and it would provide extremists with the kind of legitimacy they are craving for. That is to feed a narrative that Western governments are against Muslims.
Okay. What do you say to that, Ahmad? Because that's an obvious point, that the first time the government tries to use a mosque closure order, is going to push anything that you might want to debate or to contest underground, isn't it?
Well, let's take a concrete historical example, which is no longer with us. Remember, there was a time when Abu Hamza and his cronies had taken control of the Finsbury Park Mosque. Now, as it was, the community was able to get rid of them eventually with help. But that would have been a classic situation where, if this legislation had existed, the Finsbury Park Mosque could have been closed down while Abu Hamza was in charge of it and then reopened under new management with people like him purged out of it.
Yeah, well, that's a very good example, isn't it? Because, of course, what happened was that mosque was taken back under control, actually of people very supportive of Talha's position, through a process of debate which didn't require the law. And it could certainly be argued that the intervention of the law at a point would have made that absolutely impossible.
I don't think it would have made it impossible. It would have allowed a much more rapid closure of the mosque.
So, Talha, let me bring you on that. Do you think that would have been a better way to go, that rather than...
No, but what I'm saying is, even if I accept Mohammed Amin's argument, you know, there are one major piece of legislation that has took place. It's about Charities Protection Bill, which became Act last year, I believe. It actually provides those provisions. So if a charity do not operate, for example, in a way where, you know, they think the government or the charity commission thinks that the trustees are not, you know, worthy of their positions, they can remove those trustees. They can take control of these of various premises anyway. So I don't understand where this legislation really going to make it any better from what we already have.
Okay, Dilwar Hussain, what do you think will be the reaction if the government were to pass that into law and to use it against the mosque?
Of course, I think it would be very counterproductive, and again, it would exacerbate the situation. Once the Charity Commission has arbitrary powers to shut down a mosque, as and when it feels that it is linked to extremism or espousing extremist beliefs or giving platforms to extremist speakers, the Muslim community will go up in arms, because the mosque is essentially the nucleus of every community. And within every community, the Muslims turn to their mosques for trust, for education, to go and pray and so forth. So if you start shutting down mosques, again, it's all about that definition. And when there isn't a clear definition, what you're going to have is the implementation of ad hoc policies. And that's where the problem is, that the government's not interested in defining these terms. The government...
Okay, we seem to have lost a signal. But Mohammed, let me just ask you a final question here. Yeah. The government's elected. Nobody contesting that. 37% of the vote, 25% of the electorate. But it seems to be behaving as if it had won 70% of the vote. It seems to be proceeding with a series of attacks on the Muslim community, or will be perceived as attacks on the Muslim community, on the trade unions, on the welfare state. Have you got any worries as a Conservative that this is going to come badly unstuck?
It's completely wrong, John, to describe these as attacks on Muslims, attacks on the welfare state, attacks on trade unions. That is simply completely wrong.
Well,
this legislation, let's come back to the Muslim
but
community.
Let me reformulate the question so that we can get to the heart of the matter.
Right.
That these pieces of legislation will so anger the constituencies at which it is perceived they are directed that there will be a response which the government won't be able to control.
I don't see any reason at all why the Muslim community should be angered by the counter-extremism legislation that we're talking about. Muslims are the biggest victims of terrorism. They're the biggest victims of these extremists who've hijacked our religion.
Okay. Well, Mohammed Amin, Dilwar Hussain, Talha Ahmad, thanks very much for joining us.